Some of you may have been a little disappointed last Saturday when the world did not come to an end. I don't know how much of you were paying attention, but conspiracy theorists and self-proclaimed prophecy expert David Meade made global headlines last week when he predicted the end of the world on September 23rd. And when that Saturday came and went relatively uneventfully, Meade modified his prediction and is now saying that the rapture is still at hand, and it's coming in October. He says on his website that doomsday itself will begin on October 15th, so just 2 more weeks. And it'll mark the beginning of the 7-year period of tribulation described in Revelation. And he says that's when the action starts. He writes, hold on and watch, just wait until the middle of October, and I don't believe you'll be disappointed. Some things to watch out for, he says, are the loss of electrical power all over the world, which of course will lead to wars and famine and other perilous events. And the truth is, David Meade is just another in a long line of prophecy pundits making false predictions about the second coming and the end of the world. Similar predictions have been made as far back as William Miller, who concluded that Christ would come on October 22nd. 1844. And since that day, this Bible prophecy fanatics have just jumped on the bandwagon with their charts and their codes and the you better believe it prophecies. But if there is one lesson that William Miller and David Meade and others have taught us, it's that these self-proclaimed prophecy experts will be proven 100% wrong 100% of the time. But my question is, why this fascination with the end times? I mean, why do these prophecy pundits crawl out of the woodwork every few years to predict that the apocalypse is beginning? And why does anybody ever believe them or give them any attention or put them on the news and all of that kind of stuff? Well, I would submit that a lot of the sensationalism surrounding the second coming is due to a widespread lack of understanding of the book of Revelation. You know, even some of the most biblically literate believers just avoid the book of Revelation entirely. Frank Craddock from Emory University paints a beautiful illustration when he compares reading the New Testament to walking down the street. He starts off saying that the Gospels are the first books that you encounter, and they're warm and inviting and like well-lit homes in a familiar neighborhood. And as you pass by, you might wave and say, oh, hey, there's Mark out mowing his lawn, and there's Matthew sitting on the porch sipping some tea. And as you move a little further down the street, you come to Paul's letters. You know, still familiar territory, if not as well known as the first homes that you encounter. But then as you move down the street through the epistles, the shadows grow a little deeper. You know, 2 Peter and 1 John. And then the houses get smaller and neglected. 2 John, 3 John, Jude. And then suddenly at the end of the street, shrouded in darkness, stands the frightening, haunted house of Revelation. Not many people want to go there. And I understand why we stay away from Revelation. You know, the book is just flat hard to understand, right? I mean, it's been said if you have 5 different commentaries on Revelation, you'll get 6 different views about the book. And unfortunately, many of the commentaries are like a black hole. They're so dense, no light can escape. One funny little book titled The Devil's Dictionary defines Revelation as a famous book in which St. John concealed everything he knew. And that's pretty much the way we feel when we read Revelation. I mean, let's face it, there's bizarre images of strange creatures, a beast with 10 horns and claws of bronze, stars falling from the heavens, a great red dragon with 7 heads, the number 666, blood and bowls of sulfur, and people eating scrolls, bottomless pits, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, war, pestilence, famine, death. This isn't normal water cooler conversation, right? I mean, this is strange stuff. But the fact is, Revelation is a part of God's Word. And it's written for us to be a blessing, not a curse. In fact, right in the opening paragraph of Revelation, we find this in Revelation 1, verse 3. He says, God blesses the one who reads the words of this prophecy to the church. And he blesses all who listen to its message and obey what it says. See, when we read Revelation, we're blessed. You know, our hearts should be captured by a new heaven and a new earth, a wedding banquet, a beautiful city, and a whole new kind of life. And I think it's time that level-headed Christians reclaim Revelation. I mean, for the next several weeks, I want to immerse ourselves in Revelation with all of its prophecies and puzzles and discover what the Bible really has to say about the end times and why it matters. But before we can dive into the text itself, we need to prepare ourselves. I mean, we need to put a little primer on before we paint. And so today, I want to highlight 3 keys to unlocking the meaning of Revelation. The first key is the setting of Revelation. The first key as you begin reading this book, if you want to understand what you're reading, is to understand the historical setting of Revelation. The historical setting of John's original readers. John addressed the book in verse 4 saying, "From John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia." So John wrote to 7 very real churches, very much like our own, that existed in the first century. The church in Ephesus, the church in Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And in chapters 2 through 3, Jesus actually addresses each of these 7 churches individually with compliments and criticisms specific to their situation. And I actually preached a series just on those 7 churches and what Jesus had to say to them individually several years ago. But those are the people, and that is the place to which John was writing. Now, evangelical scholars are divided as to when exactly John wrote. So we know the who and the where, but the when can be a point of contention. Some suggest that he wrote in the early 60s during the reign of Nero, so around like 60 to 64 AD, somewhere in there. And others suggest or believe that he wrote in the early to mid-90s, somewhere around 95 or 96 AD during the reign of Domitian. And I tend to lean toward the earlier of those 2 dates, which I'll explain as we go throughout the series. But both Nero and Domitian demanded to be worshipped as gods and initiated horrible harassment of Christians. So in either case, these churches faced 2 threats. The first threat was persecution. John introduces himself in the first chapter, verse 9. He says, "I, John, am your brother and companion in the suffering." And a lot of older translations put there, "in this tribulation." And so John is identifying with them and saying, yeah, I know what you're going through it. I'm going through it too. Both Jewish and Roman persecution of Christians was real and rampant, especially for those who refused to participate in emperor worship. You know, any believers who refused to say the Roman Pledge of Allegiance by taking a pinch of sulfur and burning it in incense, or a pinch of incense and burning it, and pronouncing Caesar is Lord, were viewed as treasonous and could lose their jobs, their friends, their family, even their lives. And believers in Ephesus endured hardships in Christ's name, and those in Smyrna were being slandered, and many of them would end up in prison. And in Pergamum, Antipas had already been murdered. And John himself, as he writes this letter, is in exile on the prison island of Patmos. And a couple of early church fathers, Clement of Alexandria and Jerome, say that John was just one of several that Nero killed. Nero was responsible for the death of the Apostle Peter. He executed him. He executed the Apostle Paul by beheading. And he tried to execute the Apostle John, but failed. And when he couldn't kill him, he exiled him to this prison island of Patmos. And so these were troublesome times. These were life and death struggles. And even though the threat of persecution might be hard for us here in America, 21st century Christianity, to identify with, the second threat, I think, is very relatable, especially for us. The second threat was cultural seduction. These churches were being tempted to conform to the priorities, values, and lifestyles around them. If Satan can't destroy the church through open conflict, he'll dilute them through subtle compromise. I mean, why push them into the electric chair when the easy chair is just as good? If they'll just relax their obedience a little bit and fit in with the Roman culture, then Satan's job is done. They'll be lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, and God will spit them out of his mouth. And so Revelation was written to wealthy, somewhat comfortable churches in an immoral culture. And that ought to sound familiar to all of us. John writes to challenge these readers not to give in and not to give up. And this book isn't a crystal ball, but a megaphone, a trumpet call to faith and endurance. When we understand the historical setting, what was going on in these churches and in the culture around them, we begin to see Revelation's relevance both to them and then to us. So the first key to unlocking the meaning of Revelation is the setting. The second key is the style of Revelation. In order for us to read the Bible for all it's worth, it's crucial that we understand the style of literature that we're reading. You wouldn't read a legal brief the same way that you read a romance novel. And in the same way, you don't read Leviticus the same way that you read Revelation. They're just very different styles of writing. And we need to recognize that Revelation is a unique style of literature, often referred to as apocalyptic literature. And this style of literature tells a story. There's a narrative that flows through it, but it's replete with figurative language and fantasy imagery, such as an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and locusts that have human faces and women's hair and lion's teeth, and a beast that resembles a leopard but has, feet like a bear and a mouth like a lion. Let me give you an example. In God's throne room, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks, John describes a bizarre scene there. In Revelation chapter 4, he writes this: "In the center and around the throne were 4 living beings, each covered with eyes, front and back. The first of these living beings was like a lion. The second was like an ox. The third had a human face, and the fourth was like an eagle in flight. Each of these living beings had 6 wings, and their wings were covered all over with eyes, inside and out." Weird, right? Yeah, you're with me? I mean, this is just bizarre, strange stuff. You're not going to go to Walmart and see a creature like this, hanging out in the parking lot. This is not the kind of thing that we're used to seeing. And that's what's distinct about Revelation and other apocalyptic literature, is that it's not the kind of stuff you see in real life. While Jesus and the other non-apocalyptic prophets often used figurative language, it usually involved images that we're familiar with. I mean, for instance, Jesus compares the church to salt and light. That's a metaphor, that's an image, but it's an image we're familiar with. We know what salt is, we know what light is, we know what this does, and we understand the imagery. He often compares the church to sheep and himself to a shepherd. Again, we know what sheep look like, and we know what a shepherd is. And he calls himself the door. I am the door, and those who want to come to the Father come through me. We know what a door looks like. We know what it means to pass through a door. But in apocalyptic literature, most of the images are things that belong to fantasy. It's not the kind of stuff that we see in everyday life. Throughout the ages, Christian writers from John Bunyan to Tolkien to C.S. Lewis have emulated Revelation's style of fantasy imagery to underscore Christian truth through grand adventures like The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia. And the danger lies in missing the point of such fantasy imagery. Many prophecy pundits like Tim LaHaye, for instance, try to force a wooden literalism on Revelation that it was never meant to fit into. John's vision of dragons and sea monsters and swords isn't a literal description of actual creatures that roam the earth or will one day roam the earth. Rather, it's a fantasy portrayal of real events. His readers would be swept up in the drama and the adventure, imagining themselves as participants in the cosmic struggle that he writes of. Revelation's world of huge harlots and terrible beasts is a reflection of the Greco-Roman world of bustling marketplaces and cheering coliseums. The apocalyptic style envisions a strange mirror image of the world that we're familiar with. And the better we understand this literary style, the better we're going to understand the meaning of Revelation. So the first key is the setting. The second key is the style. And the third and final key to understanding Revelation is the symbols of Revelation. While the fantasy images that John sees throughout Revelation are not themselves real, they do correspond to something in reality. Bizarre images of strange creatures and stars falling from the heavens and rivers of blood and streets paved with gold and jewel-encrusted buildings, these are all symbolic in nature. And occasionally, John's angelic guide explains what these symbols represent. For instance, when John sees a woman riding on the back of a seven-headed dragon, the angel pulls him aside and he explains. In Revelation 17:9, the angel tells John, this calls for a mind of understanding. The seven heads of the beast represent seven kings. And then he goes on to say in a later verse, verse 15, the waters where the prostitute is ruling represent masses of people of every nation and language. And then he goes on in verse 18 and he says, this woman you saw in your vision represents the great city that rules over the kings of the world. And so the seven-headed beast symbolizes a succession of kings. The river represents a mass of people, and a prostitute represents a great city. This is the way Revelation works. Everything John sees in his vision is symbolic or representative of something in the real world. Unfortunately, these angelic explanations are the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, all throughout Revelation, we just see the vision. John tells us what he sees in this vision without any explanation as to what everything means. So how can we properly understand these symbols? Well, as we read Revelation, we'll want to interpret the symbols in three ways. First, we'll look for the biblical associations of the symbols. Specifically, Revelation is pregnant with Old Testament allusions. More than 500 Old Testament references in just 400 verses. 2/3 of the book of Revelation contain direct quotes, illustrations, or references to Old Testament scriptures and prophecies. So it's impossible for us to correctly understand Revelation without the background music of the Old Testament coursing through our minds. The more familiar we are with the Old Testament, the more easily we'll understand all of these references and images. Furthermore, we need to look for the historical association. We need to remember that even though Revelation was written for us, it wasn't written to us. It was written to the Christians of the first century who attended these 7 churches in Asia. And far too many people today interpret Revelation symbols with, a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. They're just comparing the symbols in Revelation to the latest headlines, when they ought to be reading Revelation with a Bible in one hand and a history book in the other. We can't rip Revelation's metaphors out of their historical context, like the teachers who see Apache helicopters flying through John's apocalypse. Instead of reading Revelation through the lens of current events, we need to see these symbols through the lens of his first readers, through first century glasses, if you would. And finally, we need to look for the emotional associations of the symbols. The fact is, metaphors like this, especially in the book of Revelation, paint pictures that are supposed to conjure powerful emotions. A lamb is innocent and vulnerable. A lion is fierce and noble. A dragon is frighteningly large and evil. These images are meant to stir something in our hearts. So when we read something otherworldly in Revelation, we need to ask, what feeling or emotion does this imagery evoke? And that will help us. When we know how we're supposed to feel about what we're reading, we'll better understand the point of the symbols. Now, Revelation might be the most challenging book of the Bible to understand. One writer calls it, or says of it, that it can give you a Charlie horse between the ears. But by maintaining a good grasp on these three keys, the setting, the style, and the symbols, we can unlock the meaning of Revelation. Revelation can help us approach Jesus more humbly, love the church more honestly, worship more vibrantly, endure suffering more confidently, see evil more clearly, and long for Christ's return more deeply. And it's not a haunted house at the end of the street, but a welcoming home to refresh and revive weary hearts. As we immerse ourselves in this powerful book, I promise you, God promises you that you will be blessed by it. So next week, I'd encourage you to bring a pad of paper and a pencil and maybe take some notes as we dive into the first chapter of Revelation. But in the meantime, I want to encourage you to pray along with the Apostle John at the end of Revelation when he says, "Come, Lord Jesus." Now, the world didn't end on September 23rd, and Christ is not likely to come on October 15th, but he could. He could come on the 14th or on the 2nd. He could come today before this day is over. And if you're not ready for Christ to come, then maybe you need to come to Christ. And if you need help or guidance with that, then I want to invite you to come talk with me. You can pull me aside after church, or you can call me at home. My phone number is on the back of the bulletin. Or you can just come forward now while we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.